is Ayush Alavadi and you're watching Primetime. Let's start with the headlines. The race for Fortis Healthcare is back to square one. The new Fortis board invites fresh bids from all interested parties. The CBI registers an FIR against AirAsia Group CEO Tony Fernandes, alleges violation of norms for getting international flying licenses. The monsoon hits the Kerala coast 2 days ahead of schedule as predicted by the IMD. Indian markets snap their 3-day winning run while the Indian rupee slides against the US dollar. The government nominees will propose a new policy to the board of the RBI to ensure that the banking regulator transfers a certain portion of its surplus funds to the government. Banking services are likely to be affected from tomorrow as 10 lakh bank employees decide to go on a 2-day strike from tomorrow in protest against the proposed 2% wage hike. As uncertainty over a meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un continues, a top aide of the North Korea leader heads to the US to lay the foundation for a possible meeting between the two leaders. All right, let's start off with our top story. The race for Fortis Healthcare is back to the starting line. The new Fortis board has invited fresh bids from all interested parties. Sajit Mangat joins me to talk more on this corporate development. Sajit, where do we go from here? Now, this seems like we've taken 2 steps back. Is this hitting restart or reset on this particular deal?
Well, it's a reset for the entire Fortis deal, because now what has happened is that the new board, which comprises of new independent directors, have basically laid out the entire framework of how the bidding is going to happen. The erstwhile 4 directors who had favored Munjal and Burmans are now out. 3 of them resigned and 1 of them was voted out. Now the new board has put in the entire line of how each would go. So May 31st is the last deadline for submission of EOIs, and post that the selected bidders on June 1st will get 10 days to do the financial due diligence, and then the results will come out. So so it's going to be an equal footing for all players again. Munjals, IHH and TPG, Manipal. Now they will all have the opportunity of getting into it and doing the due diligence, because IHS has been vocal about that it wants to do a due diligence. TPG is the only one which has done due diligence, but the Munjal and Burman have not done due diligence yet. So this is something which is going to be very critical, but it becomes a very transparent process here on.
So, but when it comes to fresh bids, are there any particular conditions that will need to be followed?
Well, yeah. So, firstly, all the bids has to be unconditional. That's one, because there can't be any conditions. That's the board is very clear on that. The second thing is that they will have to come in with minimum of 1,500 crores immediate cash infusion, and then they have to give a plan of buyout of SRT, which is the trust which is based out of Singapore. It also goes on to say that they will have to give an exit option to the private equity players in that trust, and the final thing is they also have to give a plan of how they want to take the hospital ahead, and retention plan, if they have any, of the existing officials or chief officials and directors of Fortis. So this is something which they have to come in as a comprehensive plan, and then it would be put in front of the board, and the board will have to take a call before it gets to the regulators and the shareholders for approval.
Okay, Sajid, now this is an interesting story, and I want you to stay with us, but we're also joined by Amit Tandon, founder and managing director of IIS. He joins us on the show. Mr. Tandon, thanks so much for speaking to us on Bloomberg Quint. Now, Sajid was outlining what the plan is all about, but I'd like to get your view on this development. What do you really make of this development? And also, Mr. Tandon, would you say that we're back to the starting line with this?
Yeah, absolutely. We are back to the starting line, whether you call it starting line or you say that the process has been rebooted, whichever way you look at it. This is something which should have happened right in the beginning. We had kind of put out a comment on this way back in I think it was April 19th where we said that, look, what the board should do is actually get all the 4 bids, or at that time all the 5 bids on the same page. They should give them the opportunity to do due diligence if necessary. They can, if to the extent they can, streamline the process and the criterion on which the bids would be evaluated, and then do so. So we're very happy that this is now being done. Again, one of the issues with the 5 bids which had been received was that each of them, and Sajid kind of spelled out the various factors or criterion which they would look at, whether it is how will they deal with SRL, what will they do with the buying out the RHT, what would they do with management, what are their plans for the hospital. For each of these, the different bidders had got different kind of plans. Some had addressed them, some had not addressed them, some had of course, different ways of dealing with it. So at least now the bidders also know what are the criterion on which they would be evaluated, what is the minimum amount which is going to be expected. Let me just actually point out there's another very interesting development. The board has also put out a separate note saying that there were some issues with the Delhi government with regard to Escorts Hospital, and they've kind of now come to fruition, and there's about a 503 crore fine which needs to be paid immediately. So that is also pretty much out in the public domain. So it kind of addresses the need for speed with all the bidders, and if someone is coming in, they probably need to put in this 500 plus crore at the beginning of the process itself, rather than towards the end of their whole negotiations and the documentation which takes place.
Amit, now that the entire process has been run by the board, and especially by directors who are appointed by the minority shareholders, do you see that there would be, or do you see any challenges to the entire bidding process, given the fact that there is a clear outline of how to go about doing it, but still you will have a lot of to and fro coming in from many of the bidders in some of the conditions?
Look, the process was earlier also being run by the board. It's still being run by the board, except unfortunately earlier there were a lot of infirmities with the process. So the board, the current board which is there, is mindful of what some of the issues were. You need to remember, during this entire process, all the bidders have spoken to the board time and time again, talking about what their expectations are, why they're interested in the asset, how they see the process being run. And I think some of that feedback has gone into the process at this time. What is also good from the shareholder perspective is that the company's kind of come out with very specific timelines at this stage, as well as you pointed out, the 4-5 items which should be included in each of the bids in terms of how they're dealing with SRL, how are they dealing with the RHT, what are their immediate plans for injection of funds, what are they proposing to do with regard to management, and so on and so forth. So some of those are already there, and now it's something which investors would also know what to look out for, and how are the board going to be evaluating these bids, what are they looking out for, rather than saying that it's kind of going to be subject to a lot of whims and fancies of the board, rather than a very structured process.
And do you think that we have seen in the
regarding the other question?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just coming. One of the things, one of the issues was, and this is true for the process which was being run both times, was that, look, what are the rights of, earlier it was the rights of Manipal TPG, and this time it is that, look, should they decide to go ahead and call for other bids, how will Munjal and Burman react? In both instances, the board has been successful in getting a sign-off from the person to whom they'd issued a letter to say that, look, we are selling the asset or doing a deal with you, to give a no objection certificate and to move forward with all the bidders afresh. So that's, of course, a positive development. And to my mind, that was the biggest risk. Had the company decided to proceed with calling up with speaking to the other bidders and not getting a sign-off from Munjal Barwan this time.
And what about the fact that in the last few weeks we have seen that many of the bidders have come out openly and informed the shareholders what their bids are actually, and they have the communications with the shareholder have been straight, and the company has been also sharing it. Should all the bids now be opened up and shared with the shareholders before the board decides?
I look at one of the issues was that there was very little confidence which the investors at that moment had in the board, and therefore the board was a lot more, in a sense, was pushed into being fairly transparent. Of course, the more cynical view is it was kind of sending signals to the others in terms of where the prices are. But my sense is that at this stage, we kind of leave it to the board. The board, in its wisdom, will decide what is in everyone's best interest, because you need to remember that this was a board which was overwhelmingly appointed by the shareholders to show that they have confidence in them. And therefore, I think it's best at this stage to leave it to them in terms of whether they want to disclose, don't want to disclose, they want to, but what stage will they disclose, etc., is best left to the board.
All right, Mr. Tandon, really appreciate you joining us on Prime Time. Sujit, now I want you to stay with us for the next story, because the CBI has registered a case against AirAsia Group CEO Tony Fernandes, amongst others, for violating norms for getting international flying licenses. Sujit, now you've had a copy of the FIR. I want to understand from you, what exactly does it entail and what are the charges specifically against Tony Fernandes?
So, this case dates back to 2013-14, when AirAsia was planning to enter India, and AirAsia wanted to go international from day one. Now, at that point in time, you had a 520 rule. Now, the 520 rule says that you need to be in operation for 5 years and have a minimum fleet of 20 aircraft before you can fly into any international destination from India. AirAsia, the allegations as made in the FIR by the CBI is based on the source information. They haven't disclosed who the source is, but what they have gone based prima facie gone on this information, and I assume they have enough documentary evidence to it, is that in 2014 AirAsia Malaysia, which is headed by Tony Fernandes and his deputy group CEO, who they wanted to get into the international route from day one, and so they wanted the Indian partner. Now, AirAsia was strategically a joint venture between Tata Sons and AirAsia, and at that point in time AirAsia couldn't go beyond 49%, and Tata Sons was the other Indian shareholder. The regulation required the Indian partner to control and operate the Indian airline domestic 51% stake. But what CBI is alleging is that there was a brand license agreement between AirAsia India and AirAsia Malaysia, which allowed operation and control of the airline by AirAsia Malaysia, and in doing so it violated the FDI guidelines because the control was with a foreign entity. The second big allegation is based on the kind of lobbying which was done by some of the Indian directors at that point in time. They have mentioned the name of Venkatraman Ramchandran, who was the director on the board of AirAsia India, and he is also the chief trustee of Tata Trust, and trusted Lieutenant of Ratan Tata was on the board of AirAsia India there. Now, he was given the assignment of lobbying with the Indian government, which is Ministry of Civil Aviation officials and FIPB, to allow AirAsia to start off with international route on day one. What CBI is alleging is that there was a cabinet note which was floated, and based on that a supplementary note was also floated there in March 2014, but that couldn't go through the cabinet because on the day of the supplementary note was floated, the election commission announced election, and there was an election code of conduct which came into being, and so that couldn't go through. And so subsequently by 2016 there was some amendments made to the the charter for flying outside the country. So those were some of the allegations. The other one which they're very specifically talking about is that AirAsia India paid a Singapore-based company whose director is an Indian. Roughly around 11 to 12 crore, and this was as a result of it was meant to pay as bribes to officials of government and many other officials who were looking at lobbying and getting this thing done. So this is something which has been doing, the CBI has been doing searches in many of the offices and residences of these officials, but how it goes forward is something which we need to look at. And the genesis of this is the Cyrus mystery letter. October 25th, 2016 is the letter where he mentioned that there was forensic audit done in AirAsia, India,
amongst many other allegations.
Amongst many other allegations, and that 22 crore rupee, fraudulent transactions were done, and it was found that it was done with entities which are not existent.
Right.
So that was the genesis of it, and so there's an interconnect between that letter and what we've seen here.
Mr. Cheeth, just as a last question, you spoke about the 520 rule and post its scrapping, how a lot of these carriers were looking at going international, and also the fact that AirAsia has pumped in a lot of money into acquiring new planes and has some serious expansion plans. This would have serious ramifications for their expansion plans?
Not necessarily. See, the point is that AirAsia is trying to expand its footprint into India, and that would continue, I would imagine, unless there's a reprimand happen from the court. So, and these are cases which will go on for many years. But in the meantime, yes, there will be a lot of cash burn, which AirAsia has been a loss-making entity for the last few years, and there has been a lot of capital infusion being done by all shareholders, including Tata Sons and AirAsia, going in the company. And so if you look at it from that point of view, the operations will be continuing as it is, but it's going to be a big dampener for Tata Sons, and a bigger challenge for Chandra, who is just trying to streamline the businesses, because now this while the case is still going on in NCLT and the decision is expected in June.
Right.
This case is also going to be a sword hanging on Tata Sons on how it has conducted the entire business.
Thank you so much, Ajit, for that analysis and for answering some of those questions. Now, moving on, there's more trouble, it seems, for Sterlite in Tamil Nadu after having its plant shut down. The company has now lost the land it had acquired to expand its copper smelting plant in the first place. Smitha TK from the Quint joins us on the show. Smitha, thanks so much for speaking to us. Now, on what grounds has the government cancelled this land allotment?
Yes, Ayush. In fact, this comes just a day after the Tamil Nadu government has issued an order to permanently shut down the Sterlite copper smelting plant. And SIPCOT has cancelled the land allotted to Vedanta Limited for the proposed expansion. Now, in the last few days, in the last few years, if I could say, the residents of Thoothukudi have been complaining, saying that the Sterlite plant has been violating norms, which has been having an impact on the environment and also causing health hazards, with many contracting cancer and breathing issues. So SIPCOT has issued a statement that factoring in people's sentiments and also the number of concerns that have been raised, they will not be allotting this land, which means Sterlite will not have the permission to for its proposed expansion. Now, this comes at a very crucial point of time, considering today was the first day of the Tamil Nadu Assembly session, and it was quite a violent one, if I could say in that way, because the opposition party DMK came dressed in black to stage to show their support for the victims who lost their lives in the Thoothukudi firing, that is on May 22nd, after the residents sat on 100 days of protest. It turned out to be a day of agony and violence when the police opened fire and there was a standoff between the protesters and the police, and over 13 were killed and at least 70 were injured. Now, they came dressed in black and even staged a walkout. Even TTV Dinakaran staged a walkout a little after the DMK came out. And the working president of the opposition party, DMK, M.K. Stalin, said that this move by the Tamil Nadu government is just temporary and an eyewash, because this could have been done a long back and it could have saved several lives. He calls for the resignation of the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu. Meanwhile, when we spoke to TTV Dinakaran, he said that if the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu is blaming anti-social elements for creating a riot in Toothukudi, then what was the intelligence doing? He also called this Jallianwala Bagh-like massacre.
Right.
He also said that right now the Tamil Nadu government has instituted a body by a retired judge to probe into the matter. And he said that having a retired judge on a panel will be just an eyewash, and that a sitting judge should come in,
Right.
and also a CBI inquiry should be conducted to find out the reason for this murder, like he had stated it.
Right,
Back
Smita.
to you, Ayush, in the studio.
Right, Smita. Very sad that a lot of this has been politicized, but thank you so much for that update. Now, let's take this forward from a business standpoint. The Sterlite plant shutdown is likely to shock the copper supply in India. 400 tons of copper from India's annual production will be hit. This is about 50% or half of the overall production in India. This makes it necessary for Indian downstream producers to import copper, but at a higher price. Now, what is the impact on Vedanta? The shutdown is likely to strip off $200 to $250 million from the company's EBITDA annually. The company is still studying the Tamil Nadu government order to figure out the future course of action. It looks like the rain gods have showered their blessings a little early this year as the monsoon made landfall in Kerala today, 3 days before expected. Here's a special report.
Monsoon has advanced over the South Kerala, and it is now the current monsoon line is up to Kannur on the west coast, interior Coimbatore, and then Tuticorin, and then most of the Andaman Nicobar Islands are covered today. As far as the seasonal scenario is concerned, it is 97%. With a good distribution of rainfall, we said, that means it will be a third successive year for Indian agriculture and the food production associated with it.
While the rains are here early, there seems like there's no respite for the common man when it comes to fuel prices, which were hiked yet again today, making it the 16th straight day of hikes. While the price of petrol was hiked by 16 paise to 86.24 rupees a litre in Mumbai, the price of diesel was raised by 15 paise to 73.79 rupees a litre. That makes petrol and diesel costlier by 3.8 a litre and ₹4 a litre since May 14th, when oil marketing companies, remember, resumed daily price revisions after a 19-day freeze in the run-up to the Karnataka elections. Meanwhile, international crude prices, like you can see on your screen, continued to trend lower after Saudi Arabia and Russia proposed easing output curbs after eliminating an inventory surplus. Now, banking services and ATMs could be hurt for the next 2 days. This is because the United Forum of Bank Unions have called for a 2-day nationwide strike starting tomorrow. The strike is called to protest the proposed 2% wage hike for employees. Now, the government wants to draw up a new detailed policy that will help ensure that the RBI transfers a certain amount of its surplus funds to the centre. Nikunjori brings us more details on the new policy that's in the making.
So the government is in favor of having a clear policy that would govern the surplus that the Reserve Bank of India gives to the government every year. Having a clear defined policy for transferring the surplus and calculating the surplus that the RBI gives to the government every year would do away with the need of government having to ask the RBI for a special or an interim dividend. Remember, last year the government had asked the RBI to give a special dividend from the amount that the RBI had transferred to its contingency fund, which totaled to about 140 billion rupees. Now, the government, so this policy would do away with this need of having to ask for a special dividend or an interim dividend. Remember, last year the government had asked for a special dividend because the surplus from the RBI had halved because the RBI had to incur additional costs for printing new notes after the government's demonetization drive. Now, government appointees on the RBI Central Board would push for having a new policy which would govern the dividend that the RBI gives to the government every year, and the board would decide whether to externally constitute a committee which would look into this policy, or whether there'll be an internal panel which would decide on the nitty-gritties of this policy. Over to you.
Well, in other news, the Bombay High Court has barred the Singapore Stock Exchange from launching any new Indian derivatives till it finishes hearing the case filed by the National Stock Exchange, seeking to stop the SGX from launching any such products. The High Court has now appointed a former judge as the arbitrator in the case and asked him to hear the two parties from June 12th to 16th. Ridhima Saxena gets us the details.
The direct consequence of the Bombay High Court order is that Singapore Exchange will now not be able to launch the new derivative products that it was looking to launch on June 4, as was promised by the exchange in its April 11 circular. The court has asked for the appointment of Justice Wajib Dar, who is the retired Chief Justice of Punjab and Haryana High Court, as the sole arbitrator in the matter, and he will hear the arguments from both the parties, National Stock Exchange and Singapore Exchange, between June 12 to June 16, which means that Singapore Exchange will at least not be able to launch these offshore contracts till June 16th. The court has also directed the Singapore boards to file a press statement notifying the order and to respond to it by May 31st. SGX, in its response through a media statement, has said that it will contest the order at the appellate tribunal, and has also said that NSE's actions will undermine the interests of the international investors on its platform.
All right, now the political turmoil in Italy spooked the investors in the US. All the indices opened in the red. The Dow Jones opened 172 points down. The S&P 500 and the Nasdaq are trading with cuts of almost 0.5%, as you can see on your screens. All right, now let's move on to the biggest story around the world. The US-North Korea summit seems back on track 5 days after the US President Trump appeared to junk it. In fact, Trump tweeted today saying that an aide to Kim Jong-un was on his way to the US. So what does this really mean? Greg Sullivan of Bloomberg News joins us. Greg, thanks so much for speaking to us. Is it looking more likely that the US-North Korea talks will go on as planned? Is it all back on track?
Well, it certainly seems that way. As you said, President Trump tweeted this morning that the sides were talking again. In the wake of Trump abruptly canceling the summit just days ago, U.S. officials were quick to say that North Korea was not answering the phone, that North Korean officials stood up U.S. officials in a planned advance meeting. So with President Trump taking to Twitter and saying the sides are talking, that meetings are happening, and with this high-ranking North Korean official coming, it does look like preparations for the summit are back on track. We know that a U.S. delegation is currently meeting with North Korean officials, and there are reports that a North Korean official is headed to Singapore for a meeting on logistics to prepare for any summit.
Also, Greg, just as a follow-up, this would also mean that the three-nation summit that South Korea, North Korea, and the U.S. have been talking about perhaps could also be on the cards as a follow-up to this.
That certainly seems to be a possibility. South Korea did not dismiss that idea, but they were quick to say that it was still in a planning phase, that they were open to it. But that the way the summit moves forward is still unclear at this point, who will be party to it. And again, as we saw last week, things can change rather abruptly. President Trump calling off the summit very, very quickly. And then here we are back again with talks resuming and President Trump discussing the summit. So unclear who will be party to the talks. I think that's being discussed right now in these meetings.
All right, Greg, thanks so much for joining us live from DC. Now, moving on to the latest from Karnataka, the elections are over. The new chief minister has won the floor test, but the political stalemate continues. Even after 5 days of hectic deliberations between the Congress and the JDS, the deadlock over allocation of portfolios continues. The Congress has claimed that issues will be resolved soon after holding discussions with H.D. Kumaraswamy. The Karnataka chief minister, for his part, said that the talks remained inconclusive, but expressed hope that they would end on a positive note. Kumaraswamy and Deputy Chief Minister Parmeshwara are the only two legislators who have been sworn in till now.
सहमति जल्दी ही बन जाएगी और ऐसा जब सम्मिश्र सरकार होता है तो कोएलिशन गवर्नमेंट में ऐसी बातें होते रहती है और ये पहली बार हमारे पास कोएलिशन गवर्नमेंट नहीं हो रही है.
All right, we'll be taking the story further. The deadlock over portfolio allocation in Karnataka and the model of a united opposition front. That's going to be on Primetime Debate, where we'll be joined by senior journalist and political commentator Ratan Maninal. Let's move on to earnings before we wrap up this show. Mahindra & Mahindra came out with its quarterly earnings today, and it was a strong quarter for M&M with both profit and revenue exceeding analysts' estimates. Yatin Motha brings us the highlights from Mahindra & Mahindra's earnings.
Well, Mahindra & Mahindra reported a strong set of fourth quarter earnings, and that was on the back of strong operating performance. The EBITDA margins for the company stood at a strong 15.1% for the fourth quarter. Of course, that was above the street expectations. The streets was working with 14.5% EBITDA margin range. Of course, this beat came on the back of strong realizations in the auto sector segment, and the UV segment probably delivered margins which were better than the street expectations. Not only that, this time the commercial vehicle, the trucks buses business also broke even, and probably that supported the overall operating performance as well as the profit performance for Mahindra & Mahindra. Not only that, if you look at the company's commentary, and on the sidelines of the press conference, the management told me that the outlook for FY19 looks strong. In fact, they are expecting an 8 to 10% growth in tractor sales. Of course, this comes on the back of strong base and a larger base in FY17 and FY18. So clearly on that base also the company would be growing 8 to 10% in terms of the volumes, and also the new launches in the UV segment will help them grab market share as well as improve the auto sector volume. So broadly the management commentary remained healthy, and on the back of stronger earnings, we had the analysts also talking about a possible earnings upgrade for FY19. But let's listen out the management as to what they had to say when it comes to the fourth quarter earnings and FY19 outlook.
We are looking at passenger vehicle growth to cross 10% for the first time in 8 years. Looking at commercial vehicle industry growth to be about 10 to 12%, with LCVs growing little higher than the heavy commercial vehicles, which we estimate to be at about 10%. Electric vehicles should see a good volume growth. It's very hard to put a percentage on it, but the ESL phase 1 or phase 2 order has been issued to Tata Motors and Mahindra, and that should therefore see good number for the industry, and we see overall demand going up for electric vehicles from fleet operators and aggregators. For tractor, full year, we expect 8 to 10%. This is on top of 2 very good years of growth for tractors of almost 20% each year. But in quarter 1 of FY19, we see a growth of mid-teens to high teens for the tractor industry. Hardening of rupee, it can go either way. We have more or less a natural hedge between our auto and tractor business, and therefore it should not have a big impact on our business performance. So all in all, I think we're looking ahead at FY19 with a lot of optimism. The word that we use, cautious optimism, is that what we use? Can I remove the word cautious? No? Just optimism. Okay, no, he has to, I have to say cautious optimism. So we are looking at FY19 with a lot of cautious optimism.
Well, that's M&M, but it wasn't such a great quarter for the state-owned coal miner Coal India. Higher employee benefits costs weighed on the profit. Revenue surpassed estimates. However, in what could be called, in this situation, we're going to be speaking to Nikki Mirchandani, who sums up the top highlights.
While Coal India reported good set of numbers, to begin with the volume growth, we saw an uptick of 4.8% year-on-year basis and 4.2% sequentially to a number of 158.86 MT, which was pretty much in line with estimates. Now, price hike benefits along with your higher volume growth led to good operational show. If you look at the adjusted EBITDA, that rose by as much as 94% year-on-year basis for this company and almost 64% on consolidated basis sequentially. to a number of around 7,580 crore, would surpass the estimates of around 6,460 odd crore. If you look at the adjusted EBITDA, this also includes the provisioning of around gratuity to the sum of around 7,384 crore in this quarter. And also, however you look at the reported employee benefit expenses, which is a big expense that we're looking at as compared to your normal number in terms of the total expenses, that number has gone up to 66% of your overall net sales in this quarter, as compared to 42% that we saw sequentially and almost 41% that we saw in the corresponding quarter of the previous year.
Well, Indian markets snapped their three-day winning streak. Heavyweights like ICICI Bank, SBI, HDFC and Kotak Mahindra Bank dragged the markets. Both the Sensex and the Nifty incurred losses over 0.5%. Agam Vakil sums up the day's market action.
Well, major equity indices snapped its three-day gaining streak, with both the Nifty and the Sensex ending in the red, Nifty declining by as much as 0.5%. What were those sectors which were bearing down on the markets? For now, we had Nifty Bank declining by around 1.4%. The cuts on the Nifty Media Index were deeper at around 1.7%. In terms of banks too, the reason behind we seeing that decline in the banking index was SPI down 3%, and it was the same for ICICI Bank as well. On the gaining end, however, we did see M&M move up and was also the biggest gainer on the Nifty on account of the strong earnings that we saw for the quarter gone by, in GAIL up as much as 2%. In the broader markets, once again, mixed cues coming in, and we did have UFlex advanced by 11%, but 1% beverages locked in a lower 20% circuit for the second consecutive day, so some concerns coming through. Can we expect a little bit of recovery going in tomorrow? Well, let's just wait and watch.
Now, the rupee slid close to $68 levels against the greenback today before settling at 67.86. The weakening of the rupee is in contrast to the strength shown by the rupee over the last few days. Dollar strengthening, continued foreign capital outflows, and month-end dollar demand are some of the reasons for the rupee's slide. Well, of course, that's about all the time that we have on this show. Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned to Bloomberg Quint.